And how about in terms of the form of caffeine? I mean, we talked about this before. You mentioned some chewing gums and gels. What about coffee versus supplemental forms of caffeine? Do we know much about if one form is superior, or is it all about in terms of the rate in which it's taken up by the body?
Hmm. So I think in 1995 there was one study that examined the effects of caffeine on endurance performance, and they had multiple trials, and including coffee, decaf coffee, and coffee with caffeine, and so on. I think it was five conditions, and they actually showed that only caffeine in the capsule form was effective for acute increases in performance, but decaf coffee with added caffeine was not. And that's kind of a seminal study in the area that showed that if you want to supplement with caffeine, coffee might not be equally effective. But one limitation of that study is that they used a time to exhaustion test for assessing performance, aerobic endurance performance, and these tests are kind of notorious for having low reliability, meaning they vary a lot day to day. So there might have been some confounding factors in that study, in that older study, but in the studies that have done something similar in resistance exercise, they usually show that both coffee and caffeine, if the caffeine dose is matched, are equally ergogenic, meaning that it can basically be personal preference, the source of caffeine that you ingest.
That's good.
Now again, yeah. With that being said, it's kind of hard to match the caffeine dose in coffee, and there's actually a really nice paper by Ben Desbro, just recently published. They show how the effects can how the caffeine content can vary day to day in coffee. So it's kind of in the lab it's easier to match the doses, but for the general population it's kind of it can be tricky to match the caffeine dose if you ingest coffee only. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense here, but
Yeah, no, for sure. It was interesting in that study. They showed obviously the Monday and Tuesday. I'm not sure if it was Starbucks or some other coffee chain where the doses were around 400, 500, and as the week went by, the amount of caffeine in that same size of coffee was going down to 250 or
yeah,
so.
exactly.
So you sort of don't know what you're getting when you're going to get a dose from a coffee shop. Now, if someone's more of a recreational exerciser, that might not be an issue unless you're starting to experience a lot of adverse impacts of caffeine. Then you may want to start to figure that out. But obviously, for athletes, it becomes important, doesn't it, to know the dose and not be subject to kind of this varying dose of caffeine, particularly if you're trying to shoot for 9 milligrams per kg. You wouldn't want to overshoot that by too much.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. If you want to be precise, caffeine capsules are probably the easiest. It's the way to go.
And in terms of habituation, I know this is one where previously it was thought that, athletes and individuals can build up a tolerance and therefore not obtain the same sort of ergogenic benefits from taking caffeine. I've seen research since that disputes that and shows that you're still going to get the benefit regardless if you're habituated or not. Where do things stand on that front, Joseph?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, some of the mechanisms of caffeine relate to its binding to adenosine receptors. So caffeine, when ingested, it binds to these receptors and can alter like RP and various other factors, and therefore enhance performance. So in animal models, they have shown that when you give animals caffeine often, there's an increase in concentration of the adenosine receptors. And based on these animal model studies, they have hypothesized that in people who ingest caffeine on a regular basis, you would not experience the same performance enhancing effects of caffeine as somebody who does not ingest large quantities of caffeine daily. So this topic is kind of, in humans, it's not very well investigated. Some of the initial studies actually showed that the magnitude of the effect is greater in the non-caffeine users. There's actually one paper by Bell from 2002 The problems with these studies is that they often classify uh, uh, users and non-users on a broad spectrum, kind of like people who ingest less than 50 milligrams of caffeine per day are classified as low users, and those that ingest, I don't know, above 400 milligrams per day are high users, and they kind of disregard the middle group, which is very relevant given that the average caffeine intake in the population is around 160 milligrams per day. And these studies are kind of that show that the magnitude of the effects differ between low and high users are limited, given that they don't use any validated questionnaires for assessing habitual intake, which is probably the most important thing to use from a study design perspective. And there's actually been a recent study, I think it was published a year ago by a group from Brazil, and they classified the participants as low, moderate, and high users and used a validated questionnaire. So they addressed some of the limitations from the previous study designs, and they actually showed they used a cycling time trial test, and they showed that the improvements were equal in all three groups. So even the low and moderate and high habitual caffeine users. In
Interesting.
resistance exercise, yeah, there's no such studies. We actually have a ongoing study where we are examining 3 different doses and the effects between low and high users, but the data collection is still in process. So I'm not sure what the results going to be in resistance exercise, but I don't see any reason why the effects would differ between a cycling time trial test and resistance exercise.
Gotcha. And
So my
Jozo, in terms of the washout period, is it around 4 days? Is that accurate? If someone did want to go through that dehabituation process, what's the washout period for caffeine?
Yeah, the caffeine half-life is usually around 4 to 6 hours. Not actually 100% sure when the caffeine is totally cleared out of the system, but I'm guessing you're right, kind of 3 to 4 days probably.